Good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
And I really appreciate all of you coming today, especially since it's a holiday weekend and it's raining. We haven't had rain in ages. First century writers were not prone to giving much insight into a person's psychological makeup or personality. Back then, most narrative writing was plot-driven rather than character-driven. It actually wasn't until the last few hundred years that narrative writing became character-driven. Yet, when one reads through the Gospels, one gets a pretty good idea of Peter's personality and psychological makeup through his actions. In last week's lectionary reading, we learned that Peter was the first person who actually verbalized who Jesus was. We also learned that Jesus had chosen him to be a leader. Now, if we didn't already know that the story works out okay, it would probably come as a surprise to us that Jesus had so much confidence in Peter. Peter was what some people might call a loose cannon. He acted on impulse, he spoke before he thought, he runs, he jumps, he yells, he interrupts, like someone with attention deficit disorder. One minute he's cutting off someone's ear, and the next he's denying he even knows Jesus, and the next he's sobbing with remorse. Peter's actions are so remarkable to the narrator that they are written into the plot of the story. I'm going to be reading now. Our gospel reading for today is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 21 through 28, and we get to hear some more of Peter's antics. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. May God add his blessing to the reading of the gospel. The lectionary is a catalog of weekly scripture selections that many ministers use because it takes care of the problem of what to preach about next. The lectionary has at least 4 selections of scripture for each Sunday. It covers 4 years. So you could actually preach for 16 years using the lectionary. The last time I preached, the scripture selection was a delightful story of how the Samaritans came to understand that God was loving and merciful. It was an easy story to tell. The selection for this week is not. Sometimes Jesus says things that are hard to understand and even harder to do once they are understood. This is one of those times, and it's been quite a challenge for him. In the last verse of last week's lectionary reading, Jesus ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah, even though it has now been revealed and verbalized, and they are now coming to believe that he really is the Messiah. Jesus' reason for doing that may have had a lot to do with Peter's behavior. The Jews expected the Messiah to be a charismatic military leader, someone who would overthrow the Roman government, run the Romans out of Palestine, and restore Israel to its glory. Peter, being who he was, would probably have been the first one to go and round up a band of insurgents. I can imagine Peter leading a rebellion, but that was not what Jesus intended to happen. In our reading for today, Jesus began to tell the disciples that he would have to go to Jerusalem and suffer at the hands of the religious elite and even be killed, but then be raised from the dead. And Peter didn't like that scenario at all. He grabbed Jesus by the arm, pulled him aside, and started to scold him. God forbid it, Peter said. This just can't happen. But Jesus turned to Peter and said to him, "Stop being my adversary." And that was what he meant when he said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." He wanted Peter to stop acting as his adversary. You may be the rock, but you are tripping me up by keeping your mind set on human expectations. You need to keep your mind on the divine plan, not on what you think is supposed to happen. Although the narrator doesn't say it, I can imagine that Peter felt stung by what Jesus said. But then Jesus gathers the disciples around him and says, "Look, if you want to be my followers, you are going to have to stop thinking about yourselves and what you think should happen, and take up your cross and follow me." Now that phrase, "deny yourself and take up your cross," is found in the Gospels 6 times. So it must be important. But what does it mean? We have our own little saying, "Everyone has a cross to bear." You've heard it. And most of the time, we simply mean that everyone's got problems. Some people's problems are worse than others. But to the Jews who lived in the biblical time period, the cross wasn't just a problem. It was a method of execution. The convicted criminal was often ordered to carry the crosspiece to the place of execution. Carrying the crosspiece meant you were getting ready to die. Was Jesus using hyperbole when he said that? He often did in order to make a point. But if he was, what was the point? Did take up your cross have some special meaning to the Jews of that time period and geographical region which has been lost to us? I have a worn little paperback book at home entitled "The Difficult Sayings of Jesus" by William Neal. One of the things that he points out is that in order to understand some of these difficult sayings, it is necessary to have a good understanding of the context in which they are said. Some of the demands of following Jesus seem difficult, if not impossible, if they are viewed out of context. He explains that Jesus was in the process of creating a tightly knit band of disciples who could be trusted to carry on with his work after his death. Jesus knew that he would soon be carrying his own real cross. Perhaps that is why Jesus seemed to be so stern with Peter. If Peter and the other disciples were going to accept him as the Messiah, they had to be unconditionally committed. It may be that some of the sayings of Jesus were specifically directed to the 12 disciples and may not apply to us at all. However, Mr. Neal goes on to ask, does looking at it this way give us the liberty to make a hard saying easy by limiting its challenge to the disciples? I'm not sure how you can make, if you want to follow me, deny yourself and take up your cross, sound easy, no matter to whom the saying is applied. We've talked about this in our Sunday school class. Just what is expected of us? What exactly does it mean to deny yourself and take up your cross? So far, no one in the class has raised his or her hand and said they are willing to go to a foreign country to witness for Jesus and be kidnapped by a Colombian drug lord or have their heads sawn off by an Islamic militant terrorist. Being a martyr is not what we have planned for our golden years. So how do we come to grips with this saying? How do we respond to these hard teachings in the 21st century? If it makes you feel any better, the disciples didn't understand much of what Jesus asked them either. The disciples had their own preconceived ideas of how this business about the Messiah was supposed to work out. But Jesus was telling them the opposite, that it wasn't going to happen the way they thought it should, that they had to leave their egos behind and carry a cross instead. Imagine what they must have thought when he said things like, take up your cross. Imagine what must have been going through their minds at the Last Supper when he talked about his blood and body. Yes, they had seen the signs and wonders, and they believed him to be the Messiah. But then he started talking about dying at the hands of the religious elite. It just wasn't supposed to happen like that. Jesus told his disciples that following him would be a risk, and because it was risky, they would have to deny their own ambitions. Jesus told them, it's not all about you. And then, after telling them they would have to deny themselves and pick up their cross, he said, if people play for safety and gain the whole world and then find that life is not worth living, what can they do to get it back again? Last week, our Sunday school lesson addressed this in a sort of way. The lesson was focused on Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church. Paul, as we know, endured a lot of hardship during his missionary efforts and ended up getting his head cut off by the Roman government for treason. The writer of the lesson said, if we take Paul at his word, preaching the gospel brought on plenty of trouble. That is not to say that we must all endure what Paul did if we want to be real Christians. It is not the life situation in which one dwells that determines faithfulness. Rather, it is what one does in the midst of those situations. William Barclay says this, in our day and generation, it is not likely to be a question of martyrdom, but still it remains a fact that if we meet life in the constant search for safety, security, ease, and comfort, we are losing all that makes life worthwhile. Life becomes a soft and flabby thing when it might have been an adventure. Life becomes an earthbound thing when it might have been reaching for the stars. Life becomes a selfish thing.